I think one of the absolutely most interesting things about Forbidden Lands as a setting is what it's not saying, and specifically what it's not saying about Alderland. Alderland is this black box. It's where all the humans immigrated to 1200 years ago and settled separate and apart from elves and dwarves who were north in Ravenland. What I plan on doing in my solo campaign is actually borrowing a lot from the lore of Alderland as is, but also taking some creative license in homebrewing some of my own details about Alderland. If you're completely unfamiliar with the lore and setting of Forbidden Lands, I would suggest watching my Forbidden Lands lore and setting video that I just made on YouTube. But for now, let's just go ahead and get started with some brainstorming on some ideas I'm going to launch from for my campaign. Forbidden Lands solo campaign lore background, I guess we can call it. So apparently humanity started on the quote eastern rim of the world, and that's where we'll start as a foundation. The eastern rim of the world is referenced right here. Legend has it that the first temple of the god Worm on the eastern rim of the world fell apart, 12,000 pillars. This is where I want to immediately depart from the written lore of the game. In my version of the Forbidden Lands, there are dragonkind, dragons actually, who are, or who at least claim to be, the chosen avatars of Worm. Worm being one of the primary gods, one of these primitive gods of the people. But let's say that there are just a limited number of them, like 100, right? So when the mass migration happened, there were 100 of these dragons who again claim to be avatars of the god Worm. And it all sort of makes sense. Worm is a synonym of dragon, and it's hard to suss out which came first, the chicken or the egg. Did the dragons come up with the worm myth, or are they possibly really instantiations of this god Worm? Either way, their role is to oversee and to guide the humans in this new land, the Alderland. If we were to fast forward, say, 1200 or so years, we would arrive at, let's say, 0 AS, or after shift. And that is when the humans were officially settled into the Alderlands. Let's say 60 years after that, there's a cataclysmic revolt against the dragonkind. And here we see 88 out of the 100 die. That would leave only 12 dragons remaining. This is an important feature, I think, because this makes the dragons less of a race unto themselves and more like singular entities. They're rare and endangered now. Let's say that another 50 years pass. So at around 110 AS, one of the dragons named Sorn establishes a secret order of the Scale, in order to continue overseeing mankind, and he does so with this council of 12 dragons. Things sort of work out more or less, but let's say that over the next 400 years, a great schism develops within the council, and in fact, 9 more dragons are slain, this time by their own dragon kind. This would bring the dragon count down to 3. Of the 3 remaining dragons, you would have Sorn, who, for all intents and purposes, is the good guy dragon, who continues on with the Order of the Scale. Vaxus Bellum, who flees to Asleen. And Virtus Maximus, who stays in Alderland but establishes the dominant order, the Congregation of the Serpent, which is actually in the official lore, Congregation of the Serpent. However, that congregation is not necessarily or specified as led by a dragon. In this case, it is. It's important to note that Sorn has to continue the Order of the Scale in secret. So the Congregation of the Serpent is a sort of dominant cult that controls kings generation after generation, while the order has shrunk to maybe just a few dozen operators who try to right where things went wrong. So that's probably where I want to start fleshing things out, especially as the timeline approaches 1165. So between 500 and 1165 AS, Sorn's Order of the Scale conducts secret missions and quests in order to maintain a foothold of influence in Alderland. In order to do so, Soren can't do this by himself, so he has to start employing specially trained humans. And this is where our adventurers will eventually come in. But these humans are essentially heroic level adventurers. Something interesting actually happens in 850 though. That's when Zygopher opens the Proto-Nexus and brings in this flood of demons. Long story short, Zygopher around this time opened the floodgates of hell, almost literally, and brought in demons. But what this meant for Soren and the Order of the Scale was a possible opportunity to topple his brother, Virtus Maximus, the secret leader of the Congregation of the Serpent, once and for all. And to do that, he would need the knowledge of Mog. Mog being the very substance of which these demons were made. Now the question here is Soren on the up and up? Is Soren a good guy, or is Soren just a power-hungry dragon? Which actually connects back to the original question, are these dragons really the avatar of Worm, the god? And then really, you have to ask the question in this particular setting, is the god Worm real? Are there even gods in the first place? At any rate, Soren starts sending operatives north to Ravenland to try and capture samples of Mog. This is obviously a dangerous, almost suicidal thing to attempt, but he regularly sends adventurers up north. But something quite interesting does actually happen after a few decades, right here. From about the year 900, the era of the Blood Mist begins. That's when these bloodlings, which are demons that take mist form, cover the land of Ravenland. And this blood mist stops Soren's efforts in its tracks. He can no longer send adventurers up. It is beyond a suicide mission. It's a complete failure every time. So Soren and his order kind of go into a state of dormancy and insulation, just as the Congregation of the Serpent, led by his rival Virtus Maximus, also goes into isolation. But it doesn't mean that Soren doesn't keep his feelers out. And the moment that the blood mist lifts in 1165 AS, that's when Soren sends his first party north in almost 300 years to again collect Mog samples in order to complete his secret mission. And that's where we'll leave off. That's our party. It's going to be 3 adventurers, all members of the Order of the Scale, all aiming to capture demons, dead or alive. The more pure, the better. So the Mistgrown are these humans who have been corrupted by Mog, but they're not pure demons. What our 3 adventurers are trying to find are the much more powerful demons, the demons like Marigal, and to somehow bring back the essence of those pure demons to Soren for reasons they don't fully understand. I actually wanted to circle back and recap what has happened with the Congregation of the Serpent in Alderland, and then maybe come up with some parallels with what Soren and Virtus Maximus are doing with their machinations. Okay, so according to the lore, the actual lore, the Congregation of the Serpent has been around since at least 500 AS. And around that time, they were getting stronger. And there's this reference to the Psychopomp, who was a sort of religious leader. It's important to distinguish the Congregation of the Serpent from the actual kingdom or the monarchy that rules over Alderland. This is sort of a Holy Roman Empire and Holy Roman Church sort of situation where the church or congregation heavily influences the crown, but doesn't necessarily rule directly. So in my homebrew, this Psychopomp is the conduit through which Virtus Maximus influences the congregation. Soren remains in hiding. In the Game Master's Guide, the first mention of a king of Alderland is in 798. The king Algamar, who is being pried away from the Congregation of the Serpent and towards the worship of Rust and Heme by some religious leader woman named Terramalda. Terramalda is eventually defeated by dwarves after she wages war in Ravenland, trying to convert that land to the worship of Rust and Heme and plunder it in the name of the crown of Alderland. She gets trapped in some enchanted armor and she's featured on the cover of one of the books. Let's say that Terramalda's prying Algamar away from the Congregation of the Serpent was a huge blow for Virtus Maximus and was actually planned by Sorn. Sorn orchestrated from the shadows the demise of this congregation, but it didn't work out in Sorn's favor. It sort of blew up in his face because Sorn didn't want all-out war with Ravenland and the dwarves up north, but that's what eventually happened. Probably one of the most important developments happens about 27 years later in the year 825, when the son of King Algamar, the new king, King Alvagard, sends this sorcerer named Zygopher up north to plunder Ravenland. I don't really want to make any connection between Zygopher and our dragons, so we'll just skip to the next major event, which is between 869 and 874. Zygopher has basically gone AWOL and is starting to build up a demon army in Ravenland, using this substance called Mog to corrupt humans and make them into misgrown. Okay, but actually in 870, there's a third king that is mentioned, the third and final king mentioned in the Game Master's Guide, King Algarod, who is the grandson of King Alvagard. These names all sound the same, but basically the third king, whose name starts with an A, makes peace with the Asleans, the humans who they were warring with up north, and he restores the Psychopomp and the Congregation of the Serpent back into a position of heavy influence. He basically rejects Rust and Heme. This naturally is huge for our dragon Virtus Maximus. Let's say that in the background, this was not just a huge win for Virtus Maximus, but also resulted in the exposure of dozens of Sorn's Order of the Scale operatives and their eventual execution. At this point, as the history goes, in 874, Zygopher unleashes demons from the Proto-Nexus, and then 5 years later manages to seal the gate by striking some sort of deal with this really powerful demon named Crescilla. And then in 883, Zygopher adopts Rust and Heme as his official religion and eradicates all last vestiges of the Congregation of the Serpent in Ravenland. Since Sorn and the Order of the Scale also had spies embedded in with the Congregation of the Serpent, Sorn himself loses any influence or at least any stream of information or intel. Let's say that the total head count for all three of these organizations are as follows. Congregation of the Serpent is an official religious organization whose clergy and other members number roughly 25,000. Those who Virtus Maximus controls directly, even though he doesn't have an official name for his group, those people in the inner circle number maybe 600. Sorn and his Order of the Scale, including all of his operatives and agents, total maybe 75. In my next video, I want to do some character creation. Maybe we can do that in a live stream. I don't know if that would work or not. Either way, I'll see you next time.